Welcome to the E Pluribus Unus Mundus series of papers. The goal of the series of papers is to provide a practical plan to enable the left and the right of America to unite. So the liberals and the conservatives of the United States of America are at such an extreme point of hatred for each other that it seems like the Union itself could suffer another attempted division. We had already one civil war in our history, and it seems we're inclining at least towards the direction of another civil war or maybe some peaceful breakup of the Union. But at any rate, at times like this, the psychologist Carl Jung said, when an ego is pulled between opposing demands, the collective unconscious mind, which is centered on the ultimate archetype of the self, also known as the unus mundus, which means one world, it compensates that conscious ego with mandala imagery. Jung said this was the greatest discovery of his clinical career. That when patients would approach him, including the co-founder of quantum mechanics, Wolfgang Pauli, whom I'll talk about in a moment, that when the ego is suffering incredibly from extreme tension between opposing demands in life, a mandala image will emerge in that person's mind during dreams and fantasies, and that mandala symbol serves as a signpost leading the ego toward a union of opposites, toward wholeness through the union of opposites. So there's the fundamental point in this series of papers about a practical plan to unite the left and the right. Jung also said that the collective psyche mirrors the individual psyche. So if the individual psyche is compensated by mandala imagery, so too should the collective psyche of the United States of America, and I'm saying the psychic structure of our collective consciousness in the United States is found in the Constitution. So, I mentioned Wolfgang Pauli a moment ago. Wolfgang Pauli, one of the co-founders of quantum mechanics, he worked closely with Heisenberg and Bohr to develop the standard model of quantum mechanics that we have today. He came to Carl Jung because he was having a lot of psychological difficulties. He was engaging in bar fights, and he was having inner chaos. So Jung saw, oh, this is a super genius in mathematical physics. He let one of his students psychoanalyze Jung, I forget which one, because he wanted to work with Pauli as a partner in trying to find parallels between the laws of psychology and the laws of physics. And the theory that they both agreed on was that if mind and matter both emerge from the same fundamental source, which is the archetype of the one, or the unus mundus, in the collective unconscious, then the laws of psychology, the laws of mind, and the laws of matter or physics should mirror. There should be a mirror symmetry between the laws of psychology and physics, because they both emerge from the same source, which I am identifying with the gravitational singularity and the encompassing horizon of the cosmos. So I know that this is starting to sound too complicated to be any kind of a practical plan, but it is complicated, but not too much, and if you listen for just a little bit and see the pattern I'm trying to show, you'll see, oh, this is actually a very simple plan, and it is remarkable how it falls right in line with what you would expect, given Carl Jung's predictions, based on his understanding of human psychology. So, if the laws of psychology mirror the laws of physics, and the mind emerges from the fundamental archetype of the self, the unus mundus, which compensates the conscious ego with mandala imagery, then we should be able to find some kind of a mirror symmetry of this mandala image in the material world. And in this book of mine, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory, which is, after my dissertation, I turned it into a book. The mandala image that mirrors the psychic mandala image in the material world is black. It's a black hole. It's a gravitational singularity, which is a perfect point of infinite density surrounded by a perfect sphere, the event horizon. So as the function of the mandala image in the psyche is to unite opposites, so too we see in a black hole that the opposites of space and time are united. The singularity is an infinitesimal point. It has zero extension in space, and yet it contains the entire universe and all of space-time. It unites the infinite past and the infinite future, and it unites all of space in a single point. It's this miraculous outcome of Einstein's general theory of relativity, which he personally never accepted. He accepted the Big Bang theory, but that initial singularity had infinite density, he rejected it, for reasons which I'll explain in other episodes of this series. But if black holes are the physical correlates of psychic mandala imagery, and if psychic mandala imagery emerges from the ultimate archetype of the self, or the UNUS mundus, or the God archetype, and if black holes emerge from the gravitational singularity, then the singularity and the UNUS mundus, or the self archetype, are the same. Psyche equals singularity. That equation is my translation of Carl Jung's equation for psychic energy. In his equation, in a letter which I call the Leap Day letter of 1952, February 29, 1952, he wrote a letter to a friend. He concluded it with this equation relating psychic energy to mass. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So the highest intensity of mass would be infinite, and the smallest space is zero volume. That's the definition of a gravitational singularity. So bringing this back to the problem that the left and the right have currently in the United States of America. This tension of our collective psyche is so intense at this point, we should expect, if Jung and Pauli were correct, we should expect some mandala imagery emerging in our Constitution to unite the opposites. And that is what this series of videos is suggesting that we do. So, with that brief background, and I know that this is, to talk about Jungian psychology is already complicated, then you add in string theory, which is just as complicated, and string theory itself is a synthesis of quantum mechanics and general relativity. I go over all these things in my book, and you don't have to understand the higher mathematics involved. I do not. I understand a little bit about imaginary numbers, which are an important piece of evidence for the mandala theory. But at any rate, the constitutional suggestions that I recommend at the end of this, so I've written 4 papers so far, which I have up on academia.edu, and I'll have a link to those in this video. There's an introduction and then 3 other papers. So the amendments I suggest are, first, add an amendment to serve as a preface to the preamble, so the preamble of the Constitution, we the people, which I'll read in a moment. So add a preface to the preamble explaining why we the people now identify each individual self with the central singularity and surrounding horizon of the cosmos. And then second, add a 4th branch of government dedicated to helping the other 3 branches harmonize their decision-making processes with this central organizing principle, psyche equals singularity, specifically by creating alternative futures scenarios and aimed at enabling our posterity to assimilate it ever more perfectly. So I'm saying if we add those 2 amendments to the Constitution, that will enable us, it will enable the left and the right to speak with each other in a way that will have an instinctive inclination towards uniting opposites, that our rational minds alone are incapable of overcoming our differences, but that the instinctive power of this mandala symbol, if applied to the Constitution, would give us that unconscious help that we need to unite opposites. That it's the fundamental function of this all-powerful archetype of the self, the unus mundus, this mandala image. Its specific function is to unite opposites. And I'm saying, as I've said before, and I'll say again, the tension of opposites it's so extreme that if Carl Jung is correct, we should predict the emergence of some mandala image to help us reunite. This series of papers is my attempt. I personally believe the archetype of the self is motivating me to come up with these suggestions. Now, these suggestions might be completely modified, modulated once I put it out in the public sphere, but one thing I think will remain constant if it's going to work at all is, because I trust Carl Jung's genius, is that it's going to have to be focused on some mandala image. And if psyche equals singularity, which in my book I think I put out a fairly convincing argument that it does, then that is the mandala image, the black holes and the inside-out black hole of our universe, which is expanding from a singularity instead of contracting into one. This overlap of the laws of psychology and physics in Leonard Suskind's string theory, I'm saying it has all of the symptoms of the mandala image we would suspect, given the prediction Jung and Pauli made together. And that the constitutional amendments that I recommend, I think they really harmonize this emerging, re-emerging cosmology, because it's very similar, I also explained in this series of papers, to Plato's cosmology and the Vedanta cosmology of India, this idea of the past, the present, and the future coexisting at the outermost sphere of the cosmos and radiating in on fundamental threads of destiny, which is what Plato calls them in the myth of Earth, the end of the Republic, to create this holographic illusion of three-dimensional objects evolving over time. This is an ancient cosmology that's re-emerging through a synthesis of Carl Jung's psychology and Leonard Suskind's string theory, I think right on time to help us in the United States of America, which is currently the preeminent superpower on the earth. For how much longer? Who knows? If we don't get our act together and start learning how to reason with each other, it won't be for very long. So again, these suggestions, I think, will help us. It's a practical plan for enabling the left and the right to engage with each other with the ultimate goal of forming a more perfect union, which is the preamble of our Constitution. I'll read that right now. So, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's the preamble of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, that's the primary goal of our Constitution, to form a more perfect union. There is no more perfect union of all opposites than a gravitational singularity, especially if we equate it with the psyche. If we, the people, can identify ourselves with this omnicentric, omnipotent point, which is encompassed by a sphere that contains all of the information from the past, present, and future of the whole universe, the instinctive pattern of behavior triggered by identifying ourselves with this mandala symbol, the instinctive pattern is to unite opposites. It's what its function is. If we focus our many different opinions through this mandala black hole lens, it can focus us on one single point, a point of ultimate solidarity with each other, with everyone else on Earth, with all the universe, with all the universes in the megaverse, all of infinity. We can feel this infinite solidarity with everyone. If both sides can agree, let's, for the sake of argument at least, and then this is another point I bring up, for the sake of argument at least, let's define our fundamental terms in our Constitution through this lens, equating the self with the gravitational singularity. A point I make in all of these papers is that even if the singularity is not the psyche, even if we live in some random material world and Einstein was right, and there's no such thing as a point of infinite density, which Michio Kaku also says. Stephen Hawking originally believed in a point of infinite density. He rejected it. It seems he might have started coming back to it before the end of his life. But let's just assume momentarily, for the sake of argument, there's no such thing as a singularity, and therefore there's no such thing as this psyche or a soul. Still, the nature of the human psyche and the way we reason demands that we have some common definition of a self in order to have any semblance of an understanding of the words that we use with each other. I get into in one of these papers the idea of natural rights based on natural law theory. We're endowed with certain unalienable rights, says the Declaration of Independence. Well, what is an unalienable right? It's not a physical thing. So if this is just a mechanistic, material, soulless world, then there's no room for things like natural rights. But in this cosmology, where the past, the present, and the future coexist at the outermost sphere of the universe, that is the original cosmology within which Thomas Aquinas developed natural right theory originally, which I will get into in subsequent papers. So at any rate, these amendments can be worded in a way that we say nobody has to take an oath claiming the psyche equals the singularity. We're just saying let's reason with each other based on that fundamental term so that we can understand each other's definitions of our fundamental words like natural rights and justice, equality, liberty. And that let's make our goal, our common goal, to increase this knowledge of the utility of this understanding of things through the lens psyche equals singularity, and to enable our posterity to appreciate its philosophical implications more and more as the generations unroll into the future. Now, the goal of that is to help our posterity, which is part of the preamble of the Constitution, but also, equally importantly, it helps us in the present project our ideas of justice and equality into an ideal future, which is what Plato has Socrates recommend in the Republic, so that we can begin to understand our own presuppositions, and the entire idea is to unite the left and the right. And so I present some psychological tools which are based on a union of the Jungian psychology and Susskind's holographic string theory for a plan to how to unite the left and the right. So as a little preview of the other papers, I read a little bit from the introduction, and now let me just read a little bit from the second paper. So this is a quote from a former professor of mine, James Dater, from the University of Hawaii in the Alternative Political Futures program. So let me just read something. This is from the second paper I put out. So I said, before attending the California Institute of Integral Studies, I earned an MA in political science with a concentration in alternative future studies from the University of Hawaii in Manoa. I went there to study with Dr. James Dater, founder and chair of the Alternative Futures program in the Department of Political Science, and winner of the 2010 Political Futurist of the Year award. So I got the idea for a fourth branch from Dr. Dater. But what I'm going to quote here is a book review he wrote about Ted Becker's Quantum Politics, Applying Quantum Theory to Political Phenomena, which was published in 1991. So in that article, here's what Dr. Dater says. After the foreword by Becker, the volume opens with a presidential address to the American Political Science Association delivered by William Bennett Monroe in 1927, titled Physics and Politics, an Old Analogy Revised. So here was one of the points it made. The constitutions of all nations today, beginning with the U.S. Constitution of 1789, derive from a Newtonian worldview dominant in the 18th century. This worldview is rationalistic, mechanistic, posits immediate cause and effect, predictive, and assumes an objective, real world which can be objectively observed and measured by a trained neutral observer. So then he'll go on to say that the social and behavioral sciences since Newton have questioned all of those fundamental presuppositions. He mentions Darwin and Freud. They suggest how marginal indeed rationality, predictability, and objectivity are in human decision-making, and then he goes on to say quantum mechanics challenges the Newtonian paradigm even more. So does relativity theory, the special and the general theory. But here's the main point is this. If our Constitution is modeled on Isaac Newton's mechanistic theory and the theory of gravity, which is implied by the idea of the checks and balances, we have three branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And each one has power to check the other, to keep things in balance, kind of like a balance beam. And that's a mechanistic understanding of human behavior, So, as we'll address in the next video in this series, President Woodrow Wilson said that kind of an understanding of the Constitution, this Newtonian understanding, might have worked in the 18th century, but now in the 20th century, and he was writing this at the very end of the 19th century, with instantaneous communication technology, because even sending a telegram, that's instantaneous, or the speed of light, practically instantaneous, and powerful corporate interests, that the government needs to react much more swiftly than the system of checks and balances allows, and that we should model the Constitution on Darwin's theory. So I'll talk about President Wilson's suggestion, but by his same logic, since Darwin, we've gone through these revolutions in physics. Special relativity in 1905, general relativity in 1915, quantum mechanics in 1927, and then holographic string theory in the early 1990s. Each step forward in physics undermines this mechanistic cosmology, which, by the way, Darwin based his worldview upon. These little bits of matter interacting in 3 dimensions of space, objectively existing material points along a timeline that flows forward evenly everywhere in the universe, whether anyone's observing it or not, no matter how fast or slow things are moving. That's the Darwinian theory. It is based on Newton's theory. So if Newton's theory is undermined by each step forward in physics in the 20th century, then Darwin's theory becomes equally compromised. But the logic of this updating the Constitution to reflect Jungian psychology and Susskind string theory is consistent with the idea that the founders of our nation modeled our Constitution, whether intentionally or unconsciously, on Newton's physics. So there's just a little preview for that paper. The third paper, I cover a lot of points in that paper, but one of them that I'll discuss here is Jung's analysis of mass-mindedness, of mass psychology, of which he was not a big fan. So here, I'll just read a little bit of what I wrote. So in 1956, the same year Congress changed the national motto from E Pluribus Unum to In God We Trust. Jung completed his first draft of The Undiscovered Self, so he was talking about the Cold War between the communist nations of the East and the Western democracies. And he was also talking about the tension between the left wing and the right wing in the Western democracies. And his main concern was what he called the spiritual and moral darkness of state absolutism. So I'll just read a couple of quotes from that book, and I think you'll see how they are very pertinent to the situation in the United States of America today. So he compares the problem of mass-mindedness repeatedly to a psychic epidemic. These are quotes: a psychic epidemic, psychic infection, and cholera, which spreads all the more rapidly the less people are aware that they are infected. So here's a block quote from Carl Jung's, what was this again? It was the undiscovered self. So the mass crushes out the insight and reflection that are still possible with the individual. And this necessarily leads to a doctrinaire and authoritarian tyranny if ever the constitutional state should succumb to a fit of weakness. Rational argument can be conducted with some prospect of success only so long as the emotionality of a given situation does not exceed a certain critical degree. If the effective temperature rises above this level, the possibility of reasons having any effect ceases, and its place is taken by slogans and chimerical wish fantasies. That is to say, a sort of collective possession results, which rapidly develops into a psychic epidemic. Under these conditions, all those elements whose existence is merely tolerated as asocial under the rule of reason come to the top. Okay, that seems to be a fairly accurate analysis of the current situation in the United States of America, that the effective temperature is so high that reason is practically impossible. And the way I am saying that we can bring this fever down, this fever of affect, of liberal and conservative outrage, is to take our ideas and funnel them through this common definition of the self. the function of this mandala symbol is to unite opposites. We don't have to. When I was writing this series, one of the ideas that came to my mind was keep your eye on the ball. If someone throws you a ball, you don't have to think through every point of the process of catching it. You don't look at your hand and then try to figure out the exact arc to reach over to reach the ball. Just keep your eye on the ball, and your hand is automatically programmed to reach up and grab it. We have to understand the collective unconscious programming of our minds and let it do its work. And that's what this mandala symbol does. Again, Jung said this was the greatest discovery of his clinical career. So if we add this mandala definition of the self, psyche equals singularity, which is always surrounded by an encompassing sphere. It's a geometrically perfect mandala, a point encompassed by a two-dimensional sphere. If Jung is correct, then that symbol should automatically help us unite opposites. And that will inoculate us against this partisan fever, which is inclining us towards tyranny or a dissolution of the Union. So here's another quote from Carl Jung, and this is, I think, is very important to keep in mind. He talks about the ineradicable tendency to project our shadow, our unacknowledged shadow side onto others. And he says it is the nature of political bodies always to see the evil in the opposite group, just as the individual has an ineradicable tendency to get rid of everything he does not know and does not want to know about himself by foisting it off on somebody else. Nothing has a more divisive and alienating effect upon society than this moral complacency and lack of responsibility, and nothing promotes understanding and rapprochement more than the mutual withdrawal of projections. So one thing I say is that it seems much easier to admit that we project our shadows on each other unconsciously when we realize that our collective unconscious mind is the cosmic horizon that projects the universe into existence. Projection is the essence of the world in which we live, and we are its co-creators. So when I just said that, let me now add a little bit of detail to the psyche equals singularity equation that represents the archetype of the self, which is the ultimate archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. So, fitting with that definition, each side of this equation can be broken into another pair of opposites. Psyche equals singularity can be unfolded into the conscious and unconscious, the two sides of the psyche, equals singularity, cosmic horizon. The cosmic horizon I am equating with the collective unconscious mind, where all of the eternal archetypes are holographically superimposed, and those archetypes project this three-dimensional holographic illusion into the volume of space on these fundamental threads. The central singularity represents the conscious ego. No matter where an observer is in the universe, that observer will see all of the rest of the universe expanding away at an exponential rate. So no matter where you are, you will see yourself as the center of an expanding universe. That's the ego. The collective unconscious side of the psyche is the horizon of the cosmos, the position of which is relative to the position of the observer. These are some of the details that I get into in this book, Psyche and Singularity. But again, this is interesting. I think it's inherently fascinating. One of my professors, Brian Swim, complimented me with that. He said these ideas are inherently fascinating, and I think they are because they're rooted in these inherently fascinating archetypes. But more than that, for our individual psychological knowledge, I think that these ideas are necessary at this point in our history to reunite the left and the right. We are in a state of emergency. It's a psychological problem, a psychological pandemic. There's the coronavirus going on, inoculations are starting to be distributed. Well, I think just as dangerous as any physical virus is the psychological virus of partisanship, which increases the temperature of emotional affect to such a fever pitch that reason is impossible. Rational conversations are impossible. So that this psyche equals singularity equation, I'm saying, is the antidote, which if people start to discuss their political opinions through this lens, that it will automatically start to lower the temperature down and enable rational conversations. So the final quote that I'm going to read is from the 4th paper, which I just put out. And so here's an experiment where we can start. All right, these are some interesting ideas, I hope you think, but how can we employ them practically right now, given our emergency situation? So here's what I say. The first step I'm proposing this series of papers is a national experiment in which we pour our many competing opinions about particular public policies through the black hole mandala of the Psyche equals Singularity equation on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc. I would like to see people defend their particular political positions, be they liberal, conservative, or somewhere in between, by grounding them in the understanding that we are all parts and parcels of the omnicentric singularity and its holographic horizon. And here's a quote from Jung. He says, "Mandalas usually appear in situations of psychic confusion and perplexity. The archetype thereby constellated represents a pattern of order, which, like a psychological viewfinder marked with a cross or a circle divided into 4, is superimposed on the psychic chaos so that each content falls into place and the weltering confusion is held together by the protective circle. At the same time, they are yantras, instruments with whose help the order is brought into being." So, Psyche equals Singularity, it's identifying each of us with the gravitational singularity and its encompassing horizon. That is a yantra, which is a visual, symbolic meditation device. I'm saying and reiterating this, if we insert this definition of the self into our Constitution and we establish a 4th branch of government that helps the other 3 branches engage in rational conversation based on this definition of the self, which serves as a fundamental ordering principle and a rational principle, the foundation of reason. And I'll talk in another paper about how this equation counteracts the Munchausen trilemma, according to which any attempt to validate your starting premises of an argument results in one of 3 problems, either an infinite regress of reasons, I believe this because of this, I believe that because of the other thing, on and on and on, or circular reasoning, I believe A because of B, I believe B because of C, I believe C because of A. It's a self-referential circle, or just arbitrarily claiming this is a self-evident truth. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the Declaration of Independence. Okay, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Why? Give me a reason why you hold those truths to be self-evident. Psyche equals Singularity, I'm saying, counteracts this Munchausen trilemma, because the singularity is an infinite regress of space-time. If it's one with the psyche, then the psyche and the singularity are both an infinite regress of space-time and consciousness. So, that seems to counteract the first dilemma of the trilemma. So if trilemma's 3 and dilemma's 2, I wonder what the 1 would be. At any rate, the circular reasoning. Again, the singularity counteracts that problem with establishing a rational principle, because it is the beginning of space-time, and it's also the end of space-time. It bends into a circle. The entire universe emerges from the singularity of the Big Bang, back towards which it expands, because the singularity exists at each point of the encompassing horizon. The past, the present, and the future of the entire universe exists at each point of this encompassing horizon, which means the singularity exists at each point at the horizon of the cosmos. So the fact that it is an infinite regress that bends all space-time and consciousness into an infinite circle makes it seem like a natural choice for a starting point, a first principle of reason, and not an arbitrarily chosen one. I know that starts to get a little more into the details. I was trying to keep this video more basic, so let me go back to this camera, which I hope has not turned off. Okay, so that will wrap up this first introduction to this E Pluribus Unus Mundus series. So the Unus Mundus, this ultimate archetype of the union of opposites, wholeness through the union of opposites, which results in a state of psychological health that Carl Jung called individuation. So how do you individuate the collective psyche of the United States of America. According to Carl Jung, individuation is achieved when a psyche realizes how all of the opposing demands in life that are ripping it apart emanate from and return to the ultimate archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, the UNUS MUNDUS. So with that, I'll wrap up this first in a series. I hope you will. You know, I've done a lot of videos these past few years, and I even put a lot of videos out for my book. Never in any of them have I said, oh, please like this video, or please share it, or subscribe. It just felt to me presumptuous. But now I am saying that because I'm speaking for the collective, for all of us. So it's a risky thing these days to express your opinions about fundamental principles, because you're likely to offend a lot of people, and I hope I haven't said anything that is going to offend anybody too much. I don't pick a side. I think the left and the right are both rooted in eternal archetypes of the collective unconscious that we need to embrace. You can't be a whole person if you're oppressing a part of your own archetypal nature. So at any rate, that experiment that I mentioned, I hope that people will, in the comments to this video, if you share it or if you start your own thread of commentary with other people, let us experiment with this mandala idea. The psyche equals singularity equation, I think, can serve as this antidote to the psychic epidemic, this pandemic of partisanship. If we can apply that in the free-for-all of social media, and it has any noticeable effect, then imagine how well it might work if we institute a fourth branch of government to employ it in the conversations that the left and the right have among the leaders of our nation. Okay, I hope to see you next time.